Alright then, today we are talking about Left Behind. Does this face the correct direction? It does, indeed. If you grew up Christian, there's a high probability that you've heard of the Left Behind series. If you didn't, there's still a high probability that you might have heard of the Left Behind series. I would say to some degree, I think it's a little bit infamous in Christian circles, or to some degree. We'll get into the details and the nitty-gritty of it, but as a brief background, this was definitely like the book of our parents' generation. These were coming out in like the 90s primarily, and continuing into the 2000s, I believe. And then in the early 2000s, they made the movies. Kirk Cameron. It has like the exact same cover as the book. Yes, Kirk Cameron. The Kirk Cameron Left Behind movies, of which there were 3, I think. Yeah. And then along the way, they made like the Nicolas Cage one, which is just infamous in the same way as most Nicolas Cage movies, I suppose. And then they just recently made Left Behind: Rise of the Antichrist with that other guy that's in every Christian movie, Kevin Sorbo. And it's pretty decent. I thought it was a lot better than the other ones. You know, it still has some, relatively stiff Christian acting and such, which is, just happens that way sometimes. But I thought it was a decent movie. But anyways, I had seen basically all of these movies before I read any of the books. I believe that like my parents maybe read like the first book or something. A lot of people have read like the first book and like no other books. But at that point, I was like, you know what? I'm going to read these books. I'm going to devote myself to it and get through them all. And I purchased 8 of them, which is 2/3 of the series. The series essentially occurs in like quadruplets. It's 12 total. So we're going to talk about that as well. Okay. So I guess without further ado, I just want to talk about, the real question is like, are these books good or not? And the question to that is really complicated. I guess it's not really complicated, but it's sort of multifaceted. And the number one thing that I would say is that on the surface, these books aren't great. They're not any kind of miraculous achievement in writing or fiction whatsoever. They set a big precedent for Christian fiction. I think this is probably still like the best-selling Christian book of all time, aside from like the Bible and maybe like some C.S. Lewis and such. But like as far as like modern Christian fiction, I feel like this it was a very successful book. Like everybody read this book. The best thing for me to compare this series to is like Dan Brown. It really reminds me of like the Da Vinci Code kind of thing. And I actually happen to like the Dan Brown books basically in the same way that I like these books. I found the Dan Brown books to be like interesting, but the fact that they were as popular as they was is really just based on the this interesting concept they have. I didn't realize my books are shaking my camera, but this interesting concept that they have that like the last generation was had not heard of the Illuminati and all that, so they're like, wow, what a crazy thing. And so I think that Left Behind, we'll start with the first book, basically captures that. And so I said that I purchased 8, and I just finished reading the 5th. And so I'm going to go do these because I have the soft covers of the first 5. So we're just going to talk about each of them and the series in general, and from a Christian perspective, what we think of these. So there's so many things to address with the Left Behind books, but I want to start with essentially the Dan Brown thing, which is that these books are not super well written. They're not any kind of artistic anything whatsoever. And, it gives... Dan Brown's probably better written a little bit, but they're written like thrillers. They're meant to be like Tom Clancy, Dan Brown, kind of just these like action thriller books. They basically took like the Christian end times and turned it into like an action thriller. And that idea is what sold this series. Like 100%, that idea is what made these successful, because it's a good idea. It's a really great idea. And Tim Lahaye is the one who's credited with having that idea, and then Jerry B. Jenkins is the primary writer. Jerry Jenkins is he's a big writer. I don't want to say good writer, but, it's hard to like critique someone when here I am, just a lowly guy. I've never written any books, and he's written bestsellers. So, like, who am I to call him a bad writer? That's really where I'm at. But, if we're identifying prose and, it's just not. It's jumpy. The plot's jumpy. And it's not very refined. They're just not refined books, but they're fun. I mean, it's a fun book. Like the first thing to talk about is probably the writing and the dialogue. It's very stiff and like everybody's funny, you know, like it's a classic like thriller. It feels like a thriller movie almost, like a really bad thriller movie where, you know, just everybody's like punning all the time and telling stupid jokes. The weirdest thing for me is that I didn't think the first two books were very good. So we have the first two books. This book is in really good condition. I bought these like used from a thrift store, and some of them are in really bad condition, and some of them are in really good condition. Tribulation Force is in really good condition. Here's the first two. The first two, what I was most surprised about is how anybody got hooked on these, because these two are not very good. And so I was like really concerned when I started with these two. The first book, one thing that you might know about it is that it doesn't focus very much on the plane thing that everybody's obsessed with, and like the Nicolas Cage movie is obsessed with, like the whole disappearance thing is like literally like this part of the book, that little part. And then the rest of this massive book is dedicated to like the aftermath and all the things that are to come. And it's really just like insanely focused on the characters. These books are like, they follow these two characters through their romance and the complications of relationships. It's literally like Days of Our Lives. It's just a family drama, and that to me is the silliest thing, especially about the first book. Like all these crazy things are happening, and like all any man can talk about is the women that they're meeting at the time. Everybody's falling in love in the midst of this apocalypse. And the weirdest, like Hattie Durham, everybody knows the Hattie Durham character is like infamous. It's like the weirdest character ever. It really is. And I felt that when I was reading this first book. And she doesn't get any better. She just gets less frequent, which makes it okay. She's just not a good character. Is basically like, it makes sense because the main character like grew up Christian, but the reason that they didn't get raptured was because they weren't a good person, and that's illustrated by his wanting to have an affair. He never follows through on his affair, which they make sure to tell you like every 5 pages, but he wanted to have an affair with his like flight attendant, and her name is Hattie, even though she's a young person, because it's like the 90s, and all their character names are just terrible. I mean, they're fun. It's just goofy. It really just feels kind of goofy. But all the dialogue between the pilot and her is just awful, and you know, it's just it's a little bit weird. I just remember thinking there's so many things that are weird in this book. They dedicate like more time to like focusing on the romance between like Buck and then the pilot's daughter. So the two main characters are a news reporter and a pilot. Everybody who knows that. I'm not going to like summarize these books. I'm just going to critique them mostly. And everybody comes together by the end of the book because they're all on the plane. Like him and the news reporter are on the plane. News reporter is Buck. The main character is Rayford. I'm going to call him Ray. Everybody's got weird names. And so they're on the plane. Everybody disappears while they're on the plane, so he doesn't get to have his affair. And then that takes up like very small. And then they all meet each other. And at first, Buck also wants to have a relationship with the flight attendant because everybody wants to have a relationship with the flight attendant. But then no, that doesn't work out. And then he meets the captain's daughter, who is 20 years old while he's 30 years old. And then that is a huge focus of this book. Something like 50 pages has to be dedicated to talking about their age differences and whether they're reconcilable or not. So Jerry Jenkins was really obsessed with wanting to address like age differences in romance and whether that was important or not or something. And that's all I can think of because that's what this book is literally about. So if you really want to read an apocalypse set book that focuses on whether you can be married during the apocalypse to someone who's 10 years younger than you, then this is the book for you. The second thing that I'll say before we go into the more specifics of the books is that the fact that this series, these are big, bulky books. They're all like 400 pages. Over 400 pages. They're all almost 500 pages. Now it's like big text too, but look at these big bulky books, and they're all like that. It's absurd that this series is 12 books long. It's absolutely absurd. When you think of the best fiction books in history, none of them are these big, massive series. I think it's off-putting, especially when you're focusing on the same characters. Like, it's one thing if you have, like, a trilogy that focuses on one set of characters, and then you have spin-off books, and it's a separate thing that people can read separately. But no, this focuses on the same characters for 12 books straight, and it's already exhausting 5 books in. That's the only thing that I don't like about it, primarily, is that it's just way too long. It makes no sense. Each book is so drawn on to focus on the little facets of their relationship. Like in every book, there's one plot happening. There's no like subplots. It's like one little plot that is happening. So in the first book, it's, okay, the plane crashed. Now can everybody convert to Christianity? And they take all these pages to focus on that. Most of it is just character dialogue and characters' inner monologue, where they're talking to themselves about, like, can they become Christian? And they meet people who try to convert them to Christian, and they all fall in love with one another and talk about getting married and all these kind of things. I actually don't remember the differences between the first and second book. They kind of run together, because the second book is also like that, which is why I didn't think it was very good either. It manages to be interesting. The portrayal of the Antichrist is interesting. I think they do a pretty good job with it. But it's just so interesting to me that in these books, the real problem is that everything going on with the apocalypse takes like a back seat to these characters' like romantic relationships, which is what I think is the silliest part. I don't remember if it's in the second book or not. I bet I could find it if I just scroll enough pages. So another interesting thing when we get to the second book, also like everybody except for the main characters dies in every book because they need something to keep you like interested in what's going on. So, but I'm pretty sure starting in the second book that the Range Rover becomes a main character. If you've read these books, then you know what I mean. They purchase a Range Rover, and like some large amount of chapters is dedicated to us visiting, picking out the Range Rover. This is in the midst of like all kinds of like catastrophic things going on. We visit a car dealership, we pick out a Range Rover, a super expensive Range Rover. We discuss how big our salary is and how we're able to afford this Range Rover. And then the Range Rover, which is always called Range Rover. Nobody ever says get in the car. Nobody ever says jump in the car. I jumped in the car. I took the wheel. It's always the Range Rover. Jump in the Range Rover. Get the wheel of the Range Rover. And then we could take the Range Rover is more of a character than any of the women in these books. It's like the third main character. And they take the Range Rover everywhere. And the Range Rover gets in accidents, and then the Range Rover gets fixed. But basically, from the second book all the way through the fifth book that I just finished, the Range Rover is the main character, and it has more plot points and development than several of the other characters, which is just so funny. These books are just really funny. I think they're really funny, but I am enjoying them. It's interesting to say that I am enjoying them because, you know, it's interesting. I feel like, I guess it's also time that we could address the apocalypse and whether it aligns. So everybody knows that this takes essentially the default view of pre-tribulation rapture and like very direct American prophecy afterwards. You can read like Lahaye's books on prophecy. I mean, David Jeremiah, people like that who have a relatively mainstream opinion of what the end times are going to be like. Personally, I take the opinion that we really can't know, and that when the Bible talks about prophecy, it tends to be ambiguous on purpose, so that we'll know the signs when we see them, but we won't necessarily be able to predict them 100%. That's why nobody knows them in the day or the hour. Like, I really think that taking all these so literally is probably not correct. I think you can take most of Revelation literally in some sense, but it's just too complicated for us to know. So I think, I mean, setting something in these is good, but assuming that this is an accurate foretelling of what the end times is going to be like is not. It could be a number of different things, and I think that's another real issue with just the concept of the series. Overall, I still think it's a good idea, and it's just too specific. And then, like I said, like each book focuses on like one calamity, when like, this is 7-year period we're talking about. So I mean, to some sense, you're like, okay, I guess it could be 12 books, but it just so little things. Okay, this is just the rapture and the tribulation force. I don't even think any of the bad things happen. I don't even remember. I don't remember if any calamities happen or if it's just like us getting introduced to the Antichrist. I don't remember. But then we get to the third, fourth, and fifth books, and they get a little better, in my opinion. The writing is still just as bad, but it focuses less on Hattie, which is good. And some of the relationships are a little bit weird. Also, in the second or third book, Rafer just like gets a new wife, like randomly, and then I'll just spoiler alert. We're gonna be talking about spoilers in case you didn't know for like the rest of the series. In like the fourth book, she just dies. He gets a new wife, and then she dies. And I just thought that was very interesting because they just needed it to be drama, I guess. And I don't know why they introduced they need somebody to kill off in every book that we can be attached to. So they just introduce a character like one book before, and then they get killed off in the next book or something along those lines. Basically happens all the time. This one is the third one, Nikolai, which is the name of the Antichrist in their series, who's from like Romania or something. This one is fun because they introduce, like, okay, so the 144,000 witnesses, which are the Jewish people who convert to Christianity during the end times, supposedly. they go and get involved in them, and they find like the leader of them, who is like this Christian Jewish guy who's like really well trained on like Bible prophecy, but he didn't realize until after the fact, you know, and then he becomes a Jewish convert. And he's actually a really fun character. I think he's a good character. And this book has a plot where they essentially have to smuggle him out of the country of Israel. And this is where these books shine. Like it's silly and it's like classical, but you know, it feels like a little thriller book. In the midst of the apocalypse, they have to get him past the Antichrist forces and like smuggle him out of the country. And that's, you know, what makes these books readable, because it's fun. It's fun to read. They have these fun characters. Like I said, they're really stiff and kind of silly, but if you just embrace like the cheesiness a little bit, it's just like a cheesy thriller. Just treat it like a cheesy thriller book, and you can be interested then in their interpretation of the end times in the background. That's the approach that I'm taking with it. It's like, okay, I want to use these books to get like the stereotypical, like, what is the end times going to look like to these people? What do they think the end times is going to look like? And I think that's interesting, and that's why I'm reading it. But it makes it enjoyable enough. And so I started enjoying the series much more in book 3, which is about that. And I think they also developed the character of the Antichrist a little bit better. And then I think it's at the end of this 3rd book where the earthquake happens. Yeah, you've just seen the Wrath of the Lamb. So, like, and then the giant earthquake happens, which they say is the Wrath of the Lamb judgment. And pretty much everything after there is more interesting, because I think these books are much better when it's like an apocalypse book. Like, it's so crazy that nothing is normal. We're not just worrying about our relationships and stuff. But they still somehow manage to take that approach, which is fine. Now we get to Soul Harvest. And Soul Harvest is pretty good, too. We get more believers. They keep introducing like more believers and stuff. I think this is the one where they break Rayford out. Yeah, so like, okay, Ray was also piloting for the Antichrist, and I think in book 4 they have to like get him out because the Antichrist realizes that he's a bad person. Oh yeah, so this is, and it's like the post of the earthquake. So in the post of the earthquake, they like go and pick up from their church and like all the people who've died in the earthquake, and they have to find a place to live because every place is like broken and ruined, and so they find somebody's house to stay in, and like a bunch of them all just start like moving in there. And also like Chloe gets abducted. Chloe is the pilot's daughter, who is Buck's wife, and she gets abducted and they have to like go save her. And it's just really interesting. I feel like this one is slightly less good. The beginning's pretty good, but like I said, the Range Rover is like the main character in the whole beginning of this earthquake. They're like so upset that the Range Rover gets damaged and then has to get fixed like later in the book. And so basically then the plot of them is like saving, apparently like the Antichrist is trying to like casually get to them and stuff. This one was decent, and this one was really good, and I can talk the most about it because I just read it like last week, and it's the best so far, because it's just more interesting. The stuff that's going on is in the background is more interesting than the characters, and I finally like realized that. So they finally make something good out of like the Israeli characters, and you get a lot of time spent with the 2 witnesses who like have supernatural powers from God, and they go back to Israel to have like this massive Christian conference that the Antichrist is allowing, but then like magic things happen to like embarrass the Antichrist, and so then he tries to take them out, and then they have to escape Israel again, but like they're all there and they're on like lockdown, and so they have to figure out how to get them out. But also Hattie's back, and she's pregnant with the Antichrist's child, and then she miscarries, and then she wants to die, and then she believes essentially that everything in the Bible is true, but she doesn't care because she wants to kill the Antichrist, and that makes her a bad person, so she won't convert to Christianity. And like I said before, everything with Hattie is silly, and she's the only bad part of this book. Yeah, they should have just killed her, like they kill all the other characters that I like, instead of killing characters that I don't like Hattie. So let's just kill Hattie, and that's my hope for the next couple books. If we could just, maybe she can get saved, and then she can die, and we can stop having to worry about whether she's saved or not, because she's not interesting. But this book is good because it has like the earthquake, and then it has like the plague of the grasshoppers from, yeah, like the plague of locusts, and it has the meteor falling to earth, and the water turning to blood, and it has like just all the interesting stuff that is the reason that people would want to read a Christian apocalypse thriller. Because as much as Jerry Jenkins really likes these characters that he's written, I don't think everybody else really does, and I have to assume that that's where they started losing people. Maybe I'm in the minority on that, but the characters aren't super interesting. They are more so a backdrop for the story to take place on. And the story is interesting because you just want to know what it would be like for people to survive in the apocalypse, the Christian apocalypse. And so that's the Left Behind series. We talked about it for 20 minutes. It's not really a review, it's just a discussion. These were interesting books, and I was interested to know why they were so popular. You can tell why they're popular. I have to assume that most Christians didn't read past like the first 2 or 3. But if they did, I think they would get a treat in finding out that the latter ones seem to be getting better. And so my hope is that they continue to get a little bit more interesting. The writing quality doesn't change a whole lot. I happen to think that the dialogue maybe gets a little bit less stiff and a little bit better. The first 2 books really focus on like romance and drama, and the last 3 focus on it less, which is way better. But there's still weird stuff in there. Like in the 5th one, they have a doctor now in their group, like a medical doctor who converted to Christianity, and so he's like secretly helping treat them, and so he ends up having to secretly help treat Hattie, the flight attendant, because she has the baby, and before she like miscarries the baby, and so he's like helping to take care of her, and she's also been poisoned. She's poisoned by the antichrist, and that's what ends up making her miscarry the baby, which is whatever. But he, while taking care of her for like 1 day, then has to go to Ray and be like, I am in love with her. I'm in love with her. And they then have to, like, several following conversations about how he's being ridiculous and there's no reason that he should be in love with her. And my only assumption is they're setting up some kind of, like, supernatural, like, he's the one who was intended for her, and God is putting them together so that they can survive the end times together, or something silly along those lines. That, or it's just this man saw her and was like, man, I'm a Christian, but I love this woman. And it's just silly. It's weird. It's like he imprinted on her from Twilight. This doctor just sees this flight attendant and imprints on her, and it's all over from there. So the series is good in general. It has some quirky things going on in it. But at this point, I am nearly halfway, and I have the other 3 on my shelf, the next 3, which look interesting because I know based on their titles that they're about, the death and the resurrection of the Antichrist and the mark of the beast and all the interesting stuff that happens in the second part of the tribulation. And so my hope is that they get a little bit more interesting. I think the primary critique is still that, you could still focus on characters without having to spend this much time with them, where like everything that goes on in the apocalypse, we are spending pages and pages and pages talking about it. So for thriller books, I really think they drag a little bit. Now, it's nice when they set up like a good escape plot and then you get to watch the escape plot unfold. But I can only imagine how many more times we're going to have to do that to keep interesting things happening for these characters, because there's just not enough content. I think the series maybe could have been half the length. I think it probably could have been shorter than that. Like if it was me, I would write like a trilogy or like a Pentateuch of like 5 books or something. But a 12 books is a lot of books to focus on these characters and to get us to the end times through 7 years. Like I just feel like we could have had one book that encompassed like everything in the first 3, and then another book for like all the mid judgments, and then another book for all the late judgments, and then probably one book for like the gathering of the armies for Armageddon, and then one book for the 1,000-year reign and the final battle and that kind of stuff. 4 or 5 books seems good to me. It's way too long. The series is way too long, but I guess they're easy to read. So they read fast, but like not fast enough because they're all 400 pages. So like 400 pages is just a long time to do all this. I really liked Apollyon because it's shorter. It's like shorter than these books. These ones are like, that one's 425. This one is not quite 400. It's like 390. So that's really nice. And I hope that the next one's Assassins looks a little bit shorter. It's hardcover. So pray for me. Pray for my discernment as I continue to just go through this series. And I thought it would be interesting to talk about this age-old Christian best-selling series and what I thought of it. And I'd love to know if anybody else read this series and what they think on it. And yeah, if you're interested in more content on Left Behind or more maybe like silly Christian book reviews, I do want to do more book reviews and just like talk about some of the books that I read, like actual good ones, and not just like silly ones. I mean, this series is just fun to me. Like, it's for fun. They're fun books, and these covers are cool as heck. Like, these are super cool, really well-designed covers. Look at how cool that is. That's cool. It's a cool cover. Whoever designed their covers was doing a good job. So, that's what I have to say about it. I'm somewhat excited to continue, but also excited to just like get to the end and see what happens. So I'm reading these relatively fast, and I guess that's all I have to say. So if you're interested in more content on these or more content on theology in general, check out my other stuff. I do a lot of stuff on The Chosen, which happens to be done by Dallas Jenkins, who is Jerry Jenkins' son. And I happen to think that The Chosen is so far better, well written and everything. So whatever Jerry Jenkins had, Dallas Jenkins has it times 10. And so that's really nice. So please like, subscribe, comment your thoughts on the Left Behind series. And I hope that this was enjoyable to you. And I thank you for tuning in.